So which are the most and least favoured servants of the Omnissiah? Today we're going to be going over every Admech unit and putting them into a tier ranking. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're putting some motive force into action and talking through the ranks of the Secretari and the Adeptus Mechanicus in general. I've organised the Adeptus Mechanicus units into a rough tier ranking, and we'll be going through each and every one and why I think that they place where they do. In terms of the way that the list is organised, there are 4 different tiers, tier 1 being the best and tier 4 being the worst, and then we'll talk through the HQ choices after that, as honestly I just don't think that buffing HQ choices really compare very well to actual damage dealing units when we're making these lists. Of course, with any tier ranking like this, a large amount is going to be based on my own opinion. If you think that I've ranked anything too high or too low, please let me know. I'll look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas down in the comments. With all that being said, let's get straight into it, and we'll start from the least of the servants of the Omnissiah in tier 4. So after some thought, the only unit that I've decided to rank in tier 4 is the Transvector. I'm afraid out of all of the units that the Admech have to offer, I think that this one's perhaps the most redundant, and you're rarely going to see it in any sort of competitive list. The main issue with the Transvector is its small transport capacity in my mind. If it could transport 10 models, then it would be decently usable and might actually compete with the Dune Rider. As it only carries 6 though, then it's just not really all that powerful as a transport. You're likely going to be paying far more for this transport than the actual squad that it's transporting. Other than that, you've only got a little bit of small arms fire, so for me I would typically take Dune Riders over this. Moving on to tier 3 now, these ones I think aren't as strong as some other options, but I would like to stress that I think the Admech Codex is actually really quite well balanced. I think all of these can still be used in somewhat competitive Admech lists. They do all have a role, but I just don't think that they're quite as good picks as some of the other options. First up we have the Sindonian Dragoons, one of the best units of 8th edition, but 9th edition really hit them hard. They can't get multiple stacking modifiers at -1 to hit anymore, and the FAQ really screwed over their Taser Lance. It used to be very easy to get exploding hits on it, and now it's just far more tame. I still don't think they're entirely useless, they're still fairly tough to take out point for point, and they do hit fairly hard in combat. I just don't think that they compare amazingly to some of the other options in the Codex anymore. Next up, though I seem to have forgotten their picture, we come to the Sicarian Rust Stalkers. Very much another example of an Admech melee unit that loses out compared with other options, specifically the Fulgurite Electro Priests. If you're taking them in a Dune Rider, I'd much rather have the Priests instead. They just hit a lot harder and can be really hard to remove in return. Though I do think that a small unit of Rust Stalkers can be helpful for an Admech list. You can use their redeployment stratagem to get around behind the enemy, maybe do actions like deploying scramblers, or even just charging and making a nuisance against enemy troops that are holding home objectives. Following on from this, we have the Cerberus Sulphurhounds, the advancing pistol-shooting cavalry who can make a decent impact against light infantry. They've got a lot of strength 4 AP-1 attacks and can hit really quite hard even on the move. I think my main issue with them is that they're priced as a cavalry unit that can do some damage. They're a decent amount more expensive than the Raiders, and their choice of target is really quite limited. You're only really going to want to go after fairly light infantry with them. Still, I'm certainly not saying that they can't pack a punch, but I feel like they're one of the harder units in the Admech decks to get the mileage out of compared with some of the others. Next up we have the Sicarian Infiltrators, again fairly close range infantry that just really aren't quite as strong as some of the Electro Priest options. Their flechette blasters and taser goes can make them really quite effective against infantry, but they might struggle against anything a little bit better armoured such as Space Marines. I'd say perhaps the best reason to run them is their Infiltrate special rule, giving them innate deep strike so they can pop up anywhere. I guess perhaps could be okay if you could combine them with a Manipulus to try and get a boosted charge, but for me I'd be looking to try and get something that's a bit more hard hitting. Next up we come to the Servitors. At 30 points for 4 models, they can be really quite a good little nuisance unit, and are really quite handy to have around just for doing things like performing actions or standing in table quarters. Now multi-melters have got a little bit more effective. I have seen some people using them en masse with a bunch of multi-melters, provided there's a tech priest somewhere on standby. It does mean that for 180 points you could be getting something like 12 multi-melter shots out of them, which isn't really too bad, even if you do need the tech priest there to make them work. Finally, for tier 3 units, we have the Taraxi Sterilizers. These ones were a unit that I was quite tempted to put in tier 2. I'll admit I'm personally not the biggest fan of them, but I can see how they could be very powerful when used right. They can either deep strike in, or even jump out of a Dune Rider, hit the enemy with a fair bit of decent shooting with the Phosphor Torch, and then still have a reasonable amount of threat in close combat as well with those Tabaxi Talons. Perhaps one of the most interesting uses of them is to use that deeply sunk Talon stratagem, 1 CP to lock your opponent in combat. It could be very nice if your opponent has something that they really don't want locked up by the Admech, though still with strength 4 and AP -1, these guys are again kind of limited to really focusing down infantry. Moving on to the second tier of units, we have the Corpuscari Priests, Onager Dune Crawlers, the Terax Drill, Cataphron Destroyers, Scorpius Dream Riders, the Skitarii Rangers and Vanguard, the Strata Raptor, and Taraxi Skystalkers. Again, for me, these were a unit that were kind of on the borderline. I'd honestly rank them about the same as those Taraxi Sterilizers. They do have some similarities, but they each have their own powerful tricks. The Skystalkers aren't quite as powerful with shooting, though can put out a fair bit of anti-horde fire. What I really like about them is their arc grenade cluster, which allows you to fly over an enemy unit and potentially dump quite a large amount of mortal wounds on them. Again, could be pretty potent jumping out of a transport like a Dune Rider. And if your opponent does have some sort of big Death Star type unit, you can maybe ping them with Steel Rain Fusillade. That can be a nice easy way to ping out a -1 to hit if your opponent has something that's really going to matter on. Next we have the Archaeopter Strata Raptor, the las cannons and heavy phosphor plane. They can be a fairly good source of mobile firepower. They perhaps might not do quite as much damage as some of the ground-based gun platforms that we'll get onto, but I think the main advantage of the Strata Raptor is their maneuverability. They can potentially castle up for a turn or two, and then jump up somewhere that's really problematic for the enemy, maybe to getting close to snipe characters, or jump forward and block enemy movement, or use the Archaeopter stratagem electrofilament countermeasures. They can also be at least fairly hard to take down if you do trade out that option for using the chaff launcher, reducing damage by 1. Next we have Rangers and Vanguard, and I think that the standard battle line troops for the Skitarii really are quite decent, but maybe not an absolute auto-include in an Admech list. I'd kind of see them as two sides of the same coin, very similar defensive and offensive profiles. The Rangers are your ones for camping objectives with heavy weapons with their long-range galvanic rifles, and the Vanguard are the ones for piling into transports or moving up the board. The Rangers can chip in a little bit of firepower with those transuranic arquebuses, and Vanguard can pose a decent threat in their own right, jumping out of Dune Riders or Terax Drills. Certainly a decent enough way of getting decent cheap OBSEC onto objectives. Next up we come to the Scorpius Dune Rider, which I think is a good example of Games Workshop getting a transport right, not so cheap that it's an auto-include, but not so expensive that you're paying more for the transport than its contents. These can be really quite good in Styges lists. Paying the 1 CP for the pre-game move can be really handy, and it means that you can get potential first turn charges with things like Fulgurite Electro Priests. From there they can whittle away with a little bit of anti-horde firepower, lock up enemy troops, and potentially even auto-explode if the enemy kills them too close to them. Moving on we have Cataphron Destroyers, one of the scariest Admech firepower units around, and they pack an absolute ton of firepower, though they are at least fairly fragile to return enemy shooting, with only having a 4+ save rather than the 3+ of the breaches. I don't seem to see people running quite as many of these days compared with other firepower platforms, maybe because they're a little bit slow, and 9th edition favours a bit more mobility and durability. For raw killing power though, these guys are really quite impressive. The heavy grav cannon is a good all-round general purpose weapon, and the plasma culverin can pretty much melt anything in the game, particularly if you're playing Riser and you use their insane plasma specialist stratagem. +1 to wound and +1 damage means that you do have the potential for a big squad of these guys to table a large amount of the opponent's army in a single turn. Unfortunately, I just don't think that this strategy is quite as good as it used to be in 8th, cover's a little bit more easy to come by, and those destroyers will be quite expensive at 53 points per model. Still though, I think they're a very powerful tool, just maybe with their weaknesses they're not quite as easy to use as some of the other examples. Next up, I did fancy talking about one Forge World model on the list, the Terax Drill, as it does provide a different and very interesting transport option to the Dune Rider. You're going to be paying quite a lot more for the Terax at 180 points, but it is really sturdy with 14 wounds at toughness 8, and this thing is genuinely going to deal some scary damage. It has a 5-shot melter gun at 12-inch range, and can plus do plenty of damage in melee as well, with that enormous drill doing some hefty damage to vehicles. If you can target a vehicle with it, then it does a damage characteristic of D3+6. I think it could be a really interesting pick if you do have some enemy heavies for it to get into. I think you do have to both use the transport capacity and its damage dealing capacity to maximum effect if you are going to be using one of these in game. Next up we have Onager Dune Crawlers. They are a unit that I was debating whether or not to put in tier 1 alongside much of the other Admech fire support units. and maybe feel that they don't do quite as much special as some of those guys, but they are still very, very good. Probably my favourite way that I'd want to run onagers at the moment is to take the Icarus array, run them as Mars so they get +1 to their strength on all of those heavy weapons, and ideally have Belisarius Core nearby to reroll all of those failed hits. Some really quite nice generalist firepower that should hose down some enemy units. Other than that, the neutron laser is also very usable, and the onager is at least fairly hard to take out between its invul save and plenty of wounds. It's certainly a solid addition to the Admech gun line. Absolutely nothing wrong with it, maybe it just lacks some of the absolute special tricks that some of the other firepower units have. Next up we have the Corpuscari Electro Priests. I must admit they're a unit that I really like in the Admech Codex, particularly since their Engine War stratagem came out where they can get AP-2 on their ranged electro attacks. At just 14 points per model, you can potentially get really quite big units of these coming out of Strategic Reserve, or maybe even out of Deep Strike if you're playing Lucius. That many Strength 5 decent AP attacks are going to make a mess of near enough anything, and they can even do some work in melee as well, with their Mortal Wound impact hits, plus more electrostatic gauntlet attacks in melee. For me, just the sheer amount of Strength 5 attacks that these guys get is just crazy. They'll just decimate hordes and stack enough wounds on high save targets that you're going to be failing some. They could potentially be a good choice for the Wrath of Mars stratagem as well, if you can get a fair amount of them in range. So moving on to the really big hitters now, and I would say that these are some of my absolute favourite units in the Admech Codex. First up we have the Fulgurite Electro Priests, who I'd hold as pretty much the default Admech melee unit right now. Pack 9 or 10 of them into a Styges Dune Rider, jump them out turn 1 and hopefully get a first turn charge. They have the potential to deal some Mortal Wound impact hits. They get a really decent all-round melee damage profile with Strength 5, AP-2 and Damage D3, and every wound roll of 6 deals mortal wounds instead. Perhaps best of all, provided they can kill a unit, then they get their Siphon Vigor special rule, which gives them a 3+ invul save for the rest of the battle, and you can even potentially combine this with something like Acquisition at any cost for 2 CP, and that can give them a crazy 2+ invul save with a 5+ Feel No Pain. If your opponent doesn't have absolute stacks of volume fire, then they're going to really struggle to remove these in return. Really like these guys, they're ludicrously dangerous on the charge, and provided they can get their buff off, they can be really hard to remove as well. Next up we have the Iron Strider Ballistari, a fairly decent firepower unit that was made into something much scarier by their Engine War stratagem Pattern Iteration Identified. Each Iron Strider will pack a couple of autocannons or las cannons, and for 1 CP you can have a unit of 5 or 6 of them get +1 to the wound roll when they're making shooting attacks. Again, they're a unit that works great in Mars. Mars can give their autocannons strength 8, and a big unit of 6 of these with autocannons and using that pattern iteration stratagem is a great target for Wrath of Mars as well. They get +1 to wound, so it means that the Mars stratagem goes off on a 5+ rather than a 6+. Say you had 24 autocannon shots coming out of them, next to a Tech Priest Dominus for some reroll 1s, you're going to be able to ping out 6 mortal wounds on basically any target, never mind all the damage that those strength 8 autocannons with +1 to wound are going to do on their own. Quite CP intensive, but between that amount of mortal wounds and conventional damage, there are very few targets that can afford to be hit by them. Next up we have another flavour of heavy firepower in the indomitable Castellan robots. Now these big guys again come with their own weaknesses. They're really not all that flexible with their battle protocols, but provided you can manoeuvre them into the right position, they can really spit out a crazy amount of firepower, with 18 heavy phosphor blaster shots coming out of each 125 point model. Those heavy phosphor blasters are strength 6, AP-2, damage 1, and I actually think that they're in really quite a good position for the current meta. A lot of things such as the new Death Guard seem to be subtracting 1 from damage characteristics, and the phosphor blasters don't care about that, so they're pretty much the weapon of choice for going through things like Death Guard Terminators. Again, much like those Iron Striders, they'll really thank you for being Mars. Rerolls from Belisarius Core are particularly potent on 4+ to hit models. Those phosphor blasters will love being strength 7, and of course Wrath of Mars is amazing when you get so many shots. I find the Castellan robots really quite interesting, really potent if you can bring them to bear, but they do have their own challenges in manoeuvring with battle protocols, plus they're not crazily durable to take out in return. Certainly a unit that could win or lose you a game, depending on exactly how they're played or how your opponent reacts to them. Next we come to the Scorpius Disintegrators. These tanks will cost you 150 points with the energy cannon, and seem to be quite a staple in Admech tournament lists at the moment. They're pretty fast, their missiles are quite decently general purpose, and I think that arguments can be made for both the energy cannon and the ferromite cannon, depending on whether you want more raw hitting power, or you want the excellent advantage of the Belleros cannon of being able to target things that are out of line of sight. Having a couple of these being able to just focus down the single most important threat that's hiding on the board each turn is really quite powerful, even if they are lacking a little bit in terms of a bit of AP. Next we come to the Archaeopter Fusilier, the incredibly annoying bomber flying machine that's usually going to be a thorn in the side of the opponent. I think this guy's perhaps one of the best ways to use the Archaeopter special rules. He can fly over the enemy each turn, deal out a decent chunk of mortal wounds to anything with a decent squad size, potentially render one unit useless per turn with its seismic bomb, slowing its movement and charge rolls by half, and again you've got the option of either the chaff launcher, giving it some really good durability, or taking the command link and the electrofilament countermeasures. Being able to turn off some enemy auras for a turn again can be really powerful. All the while it can be pinging away at light infantry with those heavy stubbers, and if your opponent does manage to kill it right in the middle of your army, you can auto-explode and deal out even more mortal wounds in death. I think it's one of the units that it's rare to go too far wrong with in an Admech list. You've got a lot of options with this thing, and it's pretty much guaranteed to cause your opponent problems. Next up we have the Cataphron Breachers. If you want a durable backline objective holding unit, then I think that these guys are some of the best in 40k. I particularly like the ones with the Arc Rifle and Arc Claw. You've essentially got the defensive profile of a heavy intercessor, plus you're mounting really quite a potent gun at strength 6, AP-2 and D3 damage, and D6 damage against vehicles. They're not useless in close combat with a bunch of strength 5 attacks, and they do have objectives secured, so basically you've got a unit that's very durable, decently shooty, and also isn't a pushover when you get into close combat. Point for point, these things are really, really good. It doesn't end there though, because I think that the strongest use of these breaches is that custom forge weld from Engine War, which allows your arc weapons to get exploding hits on 5s and 6s. It basically takes an already fairly good gun and makes it better by a ludicrous 66%. It makes these guys just crazily efficient firepower, even better in melee. And another really good buff that I quite like for them is that Holy Order Warlord trait that gives units of these guys within 6 inches of the Warlord a 5+ feel no pain. I can see why some Admech tournament lists have massively spammed these, literally taking something like 2 or 3 really enormous units with some good support, as they're pretty much guaranteed to beat down other enemy battle line units. Perhaps their main weakness is that they're just a bit slow, they're only moving 5 inches per turn, but at least they can move and fire their heavy weapons without taking the penalty. Overall a great unit, particularly in that custom forge world. Finally, last and perhaps one of the best units in the Adeptus Mechanicus are a unit that I've already talked about a few times on the channel, the Cerberus Raiders. These are basically god tier screening cavalry. At 16 points per model and 3 wounds at toughness 4, they're pretty tough point for point. They pack some reasonably decent sniper weapons and can also tangle with light infantry in close combat. Really though, the things that take these to the next level are their pre-game movement and their stratagem Tactica Obliqua. Their pre-game movement allows them to screen and move block the enemy, and combined with their regular turn 1 movement, it means that you're pretty much guaranteed a first turn charge if you want it, or to at least put them right next to the opponent's deployment zone so they're not going to be able to advance very easily. Tactica Obliqua takes these movement blocking stratagems to the whole next level though, as if your opponent wants to charge you, you just pop this stratagem for 2 CP, and your annoying dog horses can fall back 12 inches, making themselves completely impossible to charge. These guys really can hold back entire melee armies all by themselves, block their movement as they try to move up, and when they try and charge you, they just fall back and laugh. I've certainly had fun using these myself. They often punch above their weight, and even on games where they just get gunned down, they are very tough, and your opponent is likely dedicating more firepower to them than they reasonably should have to for the points that they cost. Quite possibly my pick for the strongest unit in the Adeptus Mechanicus. Finally, I thought we'd just go through HQ choices, where I personally just don't think that putting them in on a tier list really makes sense. I feel like the vast majority of the Admech HQs are really quite well balanced. It just depends on exactly what you're wanting to buff and how much you want to invest in buffing that thing. Mr. Call is by far the most expensive, but also does some excellent doctrine manipulation and gives you 4 rerolls. Datalossus from Blackstone Fortress, he gives a decent hit roll buff against a nearby unit, and if you're looking to soup up a gun line, he's perhaps the best point for point. The Tech Priest Dominus is fairly hardy to take out, has his own combat and ranged punch, and gives your nearby units reroll 1s to hit. The Manipulus can give you a little bit of extra range or movement, which sometimes is more useful than reroll 1s to hit. And the Engine Seer is basically your cheap and cheerful option. He's only good for a little bit of healing on your Admech units, though he can be a very cheap, nice choice for bearing Warlord traits. For me, out of the characters in the Admech Codex, the only one that I don't think is quite as useful is the Cybernetica Datasmith. Basically, if you're thinking of taking absolutely tons of Castellans, then he's probably a good idea, and I'd see him as a far more of an optional upgrade for that datasheet, though you can just always have the option of skipping out on him, and maybe just changing their protocol once per game with the stratagem, and accepting that you're stuck in that one once you're there. So anyway, look forward to hearing your thoughts on the tier ranking down in the comments below. I really do like the Admech Codex and Engine War as it stands. I think they've managed to balance the army fairly well. The vast majority of it remains very usable, even in fairly high competitive play, and Engine War certainly helped with that, adding a bunch of useful stratagems and different unique options. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more like this. I'll certainly be trying to keep the 40k content coming as regularly as I can. If you have been watching all the videos quite a bit on the channel, I would just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page as well. Making all these videos, particularly big intensive tier lists like this, does take quite a lot of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, any support is massively appreciated. Channel Patreons do get a fair few bonuses. They get to see certain new videos early, there's regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and there's also automatic entry to the channel's monthly prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.